"Ma'am, don't move. Hands where I can see them." The door slammed open so hard it bounced off the stopper, echoing through the apartment like a crack of thunder, and for a split second, everything froze. The air, the dust drifting through the narrow beam of a flashlight, even the soft hum of the refrigerator in the corner. Naomi Carter stood in the middle of her living room, barefoot on the cool hardwood, her breath steady despite the sudden flood of uniforms filling her space. Their boots heavy against the floor, their presence loud, urgent, certain, as if they had already decided who she was before they ever saw her face. And she didn't flinch, not when the light hit her eyes, not when a voice repeated the command sharper this time, not even when one of them stepped forward, hand hovering near his belt like the moment required it. Because Naomi had learned a long time ago that fear, when seen, was often mistaken for guilt, and she refused to give them that. Not tonight, not in her own home, not at 2 a.m. when the world outside was still wrapped in silence, and the city lights flickered through her blinds in thin golden lines, cutting across the room like quiet witnesses. And yet the tension pressed in any way, thick and unspoken, carried in the way they looked at her, the way their shoulders stayed squared, the way no one asked her name before deciding she didn't belong in her own space. And she could feel it, that familiar weight, that assumption hanging in the room before any words could define it, as if her presence alone needed explanation, as if standing there calmly was somehow the wrong response. And still, she didn't raise her voice, didn't argue, didn't step back. She just lifted her hands slowly, deliberately, palms open, her movements measured like someone who understood exactly how quickly a moment could be misunderstood, and the light followed her, tracking every inch, bouncing off the framed photos on the wall, glinting off the edge of a glass coffee table, catching the faint outline of documents stacked neatly on a side desk, details that should have told a different story but were ignored in favor of the one already written in their minds. And somewhere behind the front line, a second officer shifted, glancing around as if searching for confirmation, for something that justified the urgency. But all he found was quiet order, a life carefully kept, a space that didn't match the chaos they brought with them. And still, no one lowered their guard, no one softened, because certainty is louder than doubt in moments like this, and Naomi could feel it pressing closer, inch by inch, until even the silence between them felt like a question waiting to be answered. But she didn't rush to fill it. She simply stood there, grounded, present, her voice calm when it finally came, steady enough to cut through the tension without raising itself. "You're in the wrong place," she said, not defensive, not afraid, just certain. And for a brief moment, something shifted, not enough to change the room, not yet, but just enough to make the air hesitate, like it was holding its breath, waiting to see who would be proven right. Officer Daniel Hayes did not lower his flashlight, not even a fraction, his jaw set in that quiet, practiced firmness of someone used to being obeyed without question, and the others followed his lead without needing instruction, forming a loose semicircle that subtly boxed Naomi in, not touching her, not escalating, but closing the space in a way that made the room feel smaller than it was, like the walls had shifted inward overnight. And still she remained exactly where she stood, hands steady, shoulders relaxed, her eyes moving briefly from one face to another, not searching for approval, not pleading for understanding, just observing, as if she were taking note of every detail the same way she would study a room before making a decision. And that calm unsettled something, though no one said it out loud, because it did not match what they expected to find at this hour, in this neighborhood, behind a door they had entered with certainty. And Hayes finally spoke again, his voice controlled but edged with impatience, asking her name as if it were a formality already decided. And Naomi answered without hesitation, her tone even, her words clear. "Naomi Carter," she said, and the name seemed to hang there for a moment, unrecognized, unprocessed, just another piece of information that did not immediately change anything. And one of the officers behind Hayes shifted his weight, glancing toward the hallway as though expecting something else to reveal itself, something louder, something that justified the intrusion. But there was only the faint ticking of a wall clock, steady and ordinary, marking time in a space that had been quiet long before they arrived. And Naomi could feel the assumption still sitting in the room, heavy and unspoken, the kind that did not need evidence to exist, only presence. And she had lived with that long enough to recognize it the moment it entered a space, the way it shaped tone, posture, distance, and she did not challenge it directly, did not push against it with anger, because she knew that would only confirm what they expected. Instead, she let her stillness speak. Let the absence of fear become its own kind of resistance. And Hayes stepped forward half a pace, his eyes scanning the room now with more intention, taking in the neatly stacked files on the desk, the labeled folders, the map pinned to the far wall with small colored markers, details that did not align with the story forming in his mind. And yet he held on to that story anyway, because letting go of it required admitting something he was not ready to admit yet. And Naomi noticed the shift, subtle but there. The moment when certainty begins to crack just enough for doubt to slip through, and she spoke again, not louder, not sharper, just precise. "Do you have a warrant?" she asked, and the question did not carry accusation, only clarity, but it landed heavier than it should have, because it introduced something they had not led with, something that suddenly mattered more in the silence than it might have in noise. And one of the officers glanced at Hayes, waiting, while another lowered his light slightly, just enough to reveal more of the room beyond Naomi. And, in that small movement, the scene began to shift, almost imperceptibly, like the air itself was adjusting, recalibrating around a possibility no one had considered when they first crossed the threshold. And Naomi did not move, did not rush to explain herself, did not offer anything more than what was necessary, because she understood something they did not yet see, that the truth did not need to be forced into the room. It only needed a moment to be noticed, and in that moment, as the light drifted across the wall behind her, catching edges, textures, shapes that had been invisible seconds before, the certainty that had filled the room began, quietly, to loosen its grip. The question lingered in the air longer than it should have, not because it was complicated, but because it forced a shift none of them had prepared for. And Officer Hayes felt it first, that subtle tightening in his chest that had nothing to do with the room, and everything to do with the realization that control was no longer automatic, that it now required justification, and justification meant scrutiny, and scrutiny meant risk, and he did not like how quickly the balance had begun to tilt, even if it was only by a fraction. So he kept his stance firm, his voice measured when he finally answered, avoiding the question without fully ignoring it, redirecting instead, asking Naomi what she was doing awake at this hour, as if the time itself was suspicious, as if being present in her own home needed explanation. And Naomi caught that immediately, the deflection, the attempt to reclaim authority through narrative rather than fact, and she did not resist it directly, did not challenge the tone. She simply answered, "Working," she said, her gaze steady, and the simplicity of it seemed to land awkwardly among them, because it did not offer the complexity they expected, did not give them something to pull apart. And one of the officers shifted again, this time more noticeably, his flashlight lowering just enough to reveal more of the wall behind Naomi, where the edges of something structured, something deliberate, began to take shape, and Hayes followed that movement without meaning to, his eyes tracing the outline of the space more carefully now, the desk, the organized stacks, the small recorder placed beside a closed notebook, the map pinned with colored markers that were too intentional to be decorative. And for a brief second, something flickered in his expression, not recognition yet, but hesitation, the kind that comes when a story starts to fall apart before it is fully told. And Naomi saw it. The exact moment the certainty in his posture loosened just enough to let doubt breathe, and she remained still, allowing that silence to stretch, because she understood that the truth did not need to be forced into the room. It only needed space to surface on its own. And another officer, standing slightly to the left, angled his light upward unintentionally, the beam catching fabric against the far wall, dark, structured, hanging with purpose rather than decoration. And the word printed across it was not immediately read aloud, but it was seen, processed in fragments, letter by letter, until meaning began to form, and the room shifted again, quieter this time, heavier, like something had just entered that no one had anticipated. And Hayes took a slow step forward, not aggressive, not commanding, but drawn, his focus narrowing as his eyes locked onto the object now clearly visible in the light, the jacket hanging cleanly, Precisely. Its presence out of place only because they had not expected it to be there, and the badge clipped beside it caught the light in a way that felt almost deliberate, reflecting it back into the room like a signal, and for a moment, no one spoke, no one moved, because the implications settled faster than words could follow, and Naomi finally lowered her hands slightly, not in defiance, not in relief, but in quiet acknowledgement of a shift that had already happened, her voice calm when she spoke again, softer now, but somehow heavier. "You should take another look," she said, and Hayes did not respond immediately, because he already was, his eyes fixed, his mind recalculating, the certainty that had brought him here unraveling thread by thread, replaced by something far less comfortable, the realization that this was not what he thought it was, that she was not who he assumed she was, and that the authority he carried into this room might not be the highest one present after all. No one reached for anything anymore, no one gave another command, and the room that had entered with urgency now stood suspended in a silence that felt heavier than any raised voice could have been, and Officer Hayes kept his eyes fixed on the jacket, reading it again as if the letters might change if he stared long enough, as if there might be some explanation that returned control to him. But there was none, only the quiet, undeniable presence of something that outranked the certainty he had walked in with, and he felt it settle into his posture, into the slight shift of his shoulders, into the way his grip on the flashlight loosened just enough to no longer look like authority, but something closer to uncertainty, and behind him, one of the officers cleared his throat softly, not speaking, just acknowledging what they were all now seeing, what none of them had expected to see, and Naomi watched it happen without moving, without pressing, because she understood that this moment did not belong to words, it belonged to realization. The slow, unavoidable kind that rewrites everything in silence. And Hayes finally stepped closer, not toward her, but toward the wall, his movement careful now, measured in a way it had not been before, like each step required permission he no longer assumed he had, and the beam of his light steadied on the badge, the identification clipped beside the jacket, the name visible now, clear and precise, Carter, Naomi, and something in his expression shifted fully then, not confusion, not doubt, but recognition layered with the weight of what it meant, and he lowered the flashlight completely, the first real break in the stance he had carried into the room, and for a moment he said nothing, because there was nothing immediate to say that could bridge the distance between what had just happened and what should have happened, and Naomi lowered her hands the rest of the way, slowly, deliberately, her movements no longer needing to be cautious, but still calm, still controlled, because that was who she was regardless of who stood in front of her, and she took a single step forward, not aggressive, not confrontational, just enough to stand fully in the light now that no longer searched her. And her voice when it came was steady, grounded. "Agent Naomi Carter," she said, not as a correction, not as a challenge, but as a fact that had been there all along, waiting to be seen, and Hayes exhaled quietly, a breath he did not realize he had been holding, his gaze dropping for a brief second before lifting again, meeting hers now without the same edge, without the same assumption, and the shift was complete, not loud, not dramatic, but absolute, because authority had changed hands. Without a single raised voice, and one of the officers behind him took a small step back, almost instinctively, creating space where before there had been pressure, and Hayes finally spoke, his tone lower now, stripped of the certainty that had filled it before. "We were responding to a call," he said, and even that sounded different, less like a justification and more like something he needed to say out loud to make sense of the moment. And Naomi nodded once, not dismissing it, not validating it either, just acknowledging that there was a process, that things happened for reasons, but also that those reasons did not erase what had just occurred, and she turned slightly, gesturing toward the desk, the files, the quiet evidence of work that had been ongoing long before they arrived. "So was I," she said, and the words landed gently but firmly, drawing a line between presence and purpose, between assumption and reality. And Hayes glanced once more at the room, seeing it now not as a place to search, but as a space that had already been in motion, already part of something larger than what he had imagined, and the silence returned. But this time it was different, no longer tense, no longer uncertain, but reflective, carrying with it the weight of a moment that could not be undone, only understood. The silence did not break right away. It settled, stretching across the room like something tangible, something both sides now had to stand inside. And Officer Hayes remained where he was for a moment longer than necessary, his eyes no longer scanning for threat, but searching for understanding, for a way to reconcile the image he had formed before entering with the reality now standing in front of him. And it was not easy, because certainty had come quickly, loudly, and without question, while truth had arrived quietly, asking only to be noticed, and that imbalance lingered in the air, shaping the way no one rushed to speak, the way even the smallest movements felt deliberate. And behind him one of the officers shifted again, this time stepping back fully, creating a wider space between them and Naomi, as if distance itself could correct what had already happened. And another lowered his flashlight completely, letting the room return to its natural light, dim but honest, no longer interrogating, just revealing. And Naomi stood in that light now, no longer framed as a subject, but present as herself, her posture unchanged, her calm intact. And she moved toward the desk with quiet purpose, not to prove anything, not to defend herself, but to continue what had been interrupted, her hand brushing lightly against the edge of a folder as she straightened it, a small gesture that carried more weight than any explanation could have, because it reminded them that her night had not begun with them, that her work existed before their arrival and would continue after their departure. And Hayes noticed that, the normalcy of it, the absence of fear or resentment in her actions, and it unsettled him in a different way, because it offered no easy reaction, no anger to respond to, no resistance to push against, only composure that reflected his own misjudgment back at him without saying it out loud. And he finally cleared his throat, the sound quiet but enough to shift attention back to him, his voice lower now, stripped of its earlier certainty. "Agent Carter," he said, the title coming carefully, as if acknowledging it required adjustment. There was a report, a possible disturbance, and the explanation felt smaller than it had when he first believed it, less solid, more like something he needed to say than something that truly justified the moment. And Naomi paused, not turning immediately, giving the words space to settle before she responded. And when she did, her tone was even, not dismissive, not confrontational. "Then you followed procedure," she said, and there was no accusation in it, only a statement of fact that did not excuse the outcome. And Hayes nodded slightly, though the motion felt incomplete, because procedure alone did not account for everything that had happened in the last few minutes. And he knew that, even if he did not say it out loud. And another officer glanced toward the door, then back at Hayes, silently asking the question none of them had voiced yet. What now? And Hayes seemed to feel it, his posture shifting again, less rigid, more reflective, and he took a step back, not retreating, but creating distance where before there had been assumption. And Naomi finally turned to face them fully again, her eyes steady, not hard, not forgiving either, just present. And in that moment the balance in the room had fully changed, not because she demanded it, but because she never needed to. And Hayes held her gaze for a second longer, then nodded once, a gesture that carried acknowledgement more than authority. And without another command, without another raised voice, the energy that had filled the room began to dissolve, leaving behind something quieter, something more difficult to ignore, the understanding that what had just happened could not be undone, only carried forward in the way they chose to leave. And Naomi stood there as they began to shift toward the door, not watching them with judgment, not turning away either, simply present in the space that was hers all along, as the weight of the moment followed them out in silence. The hallway outside felt colder than when they had entered, not because the temperature had changed, but because something unspoken now followed them, settling into the quiet shuffle of boots against the floor, the soft click of equipment being adjusted, the absence of urgency that had once filled every movement. And inside the apartment, Naomi did not rush to close the door behind them. She simply stood where she was for a moment, listening as the last trace of their presence faded into the distance, the building returning to its natural stillness, the kind that hums softly beneath everything when nothing is being forced. And she exhaled slowly, not in relief, not in frustration, just a controlled release of tension that had never fully shown on the surface. her shoulders lowering by a fraction, her gaze drifting toward the wall where the jacket still hung, unmoved, unchanged, a quiet symbol that had shifted everything without needing to be touched, and she stepped toward it with calm purpose, her fingers brushing lightly against the fabric as if confirming it was real, though she had never doubted it. And the badge caught the faint light again, reflecting it in a small, steady glint that felt almost like a reminder rather than a statement, and she turned back toward the room, taking in the details that had been interrupted, the open file on the desk, the recorder paused mid-note, the map still marked with points that told a story only she fully understood, and for a moment she just stood there, allowing the space to settle, allowing the silence to return to what it had been before. Not heavy, not tense, just present, and her mind moved forward. Again, not backward, not replaying what had happened, because she had learned long ago that moments like that did not need to be relived to be understood. They simply became part of the pattern, part of the reason she did her work the way she did, with precision, with restraint, with the awareness that perception could change faster than truth if left unchecked. And outside, in the dim hallway, Hayes paused near the stairwell, his hand resting lightly against the railing as the other officers moved past him, none of them speaking, none of them meeting his eyes, because there was nothing to say that would not make the moment more real than it already was. And he looked back once, not at her directly, but at the doorway, at the space they had entered with certainty and left with something far more complicated. And he stood there for a second longer than necessary, as if considering something he had not considered before, something quieter than procedure, something that did not come from training but from reflection. And then he turned away, his steps slower now, less defined by urgency, more by thought, and inside the apartment Naomi picked up the pen from her desk, the same pen she had been using before everything shifted, and she placed it against the page without hesitation, continuing her notes as if the interruption had been nothing more than a pause, her handwriting steady, deliberate, each word forming with the same clarity she had carried through the entire encounter. And the room remained still around her, the clock ticking softly on the wall, the city lights filtering in through the blinds, and in that quiet, the difference between assumption and truth lingered, not spoken, not emphasized, but understood, resting in the space where noise had once been, leaving behind a kind of silence that did not ask for attention, only recognition. The pen moved steadily across the page, each line forming with quiet precision. But Naomi was not just writing. She was aligning thoughts that had already settled long before this night, organizing details that fit into a larger picture no one else in that hallway had seen, and the soft scratch of ink against paper became the only sound in the room for several seconds, grounding, consistent, until a faint vibration broke through the stillness from the edge of the desk, her phone lighting up, briefly with a single incoming call, and she did not reach for it immediately, her eyes finishing the sentence she was on, her hand completing the final word before she set the pen down carefully beside the notebook, her movements never rushed, never reactive. And when she finally picked up the phone, her expression did not change, but her focus sharpened, the quiet shift of someone stepping fully into purpose. And she answered without hesitation, her voice low, controlled. "Carter," she said. And on the other end, a voice responded quickly, urgent but contained, feeding her information that seemed to connect directly to the documents laid out in front of her, references to locations, timelines, patterns that mirrored the colored markers on her wall. And Naomi listened without interrupting, her gaze drifting briefly to the map, aligning what she heard with what she already knew. And when she spoke again, it was concise, precise. "They moved sooner than expected," she said, not as a question, but as confirmation, and the voice on the other end agreed, adding one more detail that made her pause for the first time, not out of uncertainty, but calculation. And she turned slightly, her eyes landing on a specific point marked in red, a location that now carried more weight than the others. And outside, down in the dim parking lot, Hayes reached his cruiser but did not open the door right away, his hand resting on the handle as he stared ahead, the night air cool against his face, and something about the quiet above him pulled his attention back toward the building. Not curiosity, not suspicion, something closer to reflection, and he exhaled slowly, his mind replaying the moment without needing to force it, the calm in her voice, the steadiness in her posture, the way the entire situation had shifted without confrontation, and it stayed with him in a way that procedure never did, because procedure was clear, defined. But this was something else, something that did not fit into a report, and back. Upstairs, Naomi ended the call with a simple acknowledgement. No extra words, no lingering tone, just clarity, and she set the phone down beside the file, her fingers resting on it for a brief second before she moved again. This time toward the wall, her steps measured, purposeful, and she reached up to the jacket, not to remove it, but to take the badge from its clip. The metal cool against her fingertips as she held it for a moment, considering the weight it carried, not as authority, but as responsibility, and she slipped it into her pocket with quiet finality, her gaze returning to the map as she traced the route between points with her eyes, connecting movement, intention, timing, and the room seemed to shift again, not in tension, but in focus, as if everything inside it now aligned toward a single direction, a single purpose that extended far beyond what had just occurred. And Naomi stepped back, her shoulders straight, her expression unchanged, but her presence sharper now, more defined, as if the interruption had not delayed her work, but clarified it. And outside, Hayes finally opened his car door, pausing one last time before getting in, his eyes lifting toward the darkened windows above, unaware that the story he thought he had interrupted was already unfolding on a scale far larger than he had imagined. And inside, Naomi reached for her keys, the soft jingle echoing briefly in the quiet room, and without hesitation, she moved toward the door, leaving the light on behind her, the file still open, the map still marked, the silence still holding everything that had been revealed. As she stepped forward into the night, not reacting to what had happened, but continuing exactly where she had always been headed. The night air carried a quiet chill as Naomi stepped out into the dimly lit parking lot, the soft glow of streetlights stretching long shadows across the pavement, and her footsteps were steady, unhurried, as if the events inside her apartment had not disrupted her rhythm, but simply redirected it, her eyes scanning the space with calm awareness, not searching for danger, but reading the environment the way she always did. Noticing the stillness of parked cars, the faint hum of distant traffic, the subtle shift of a curtain in a nearby window, details that most would overlook but to her formed a pattern, a context, and she moved toward her car without hesitation, keys already in hand, the metal cool against her fingers, while across the lot Officer Hayes stood beside his cruiser, his door now open but forgotten, his attention drawn back to her presence, as if something unfinished lingered between them, not a conflict, not a confrontation, but a question he had not yet asked himself fully. And he watched as she approached, her posture unchanged, her focus forward, and for a brief moment he considered saying something, offering an explanation, an apology, something that could place a frame around what had happened, but the words did not come easily, because anything spoken now would feel smaller than the silence that already held the truth. And Naomi reached her car, pausing only long enough to unlock it before placing her hand on the door, and in that stillness she sensed his gaze, not intrusive, not commanding, just present, and she turned her head slightly, meeting his eyes across the distance, not challenging, not inviting, simply acknowledging. And that single glance carried more than any conversation could, because it reflected everything that had shifted in the last few minutes. Everything that no longer needed to be said out loud. And Hayes straightened slightly, his shoulders pulling back as if instinctively trying to reclaim something. But he stopped himself halfway, the motion fading into something more honest, more grounded, and he took a step forward, closing part of the distance, his voice finally breaking the quiet, low, measured, "Agent Carter," he said again, this time without hesitation, without adjustment, and Naomi waited, her expression neutral, giving him space to continue, and he held that moment, choosing his words carefully, not from protocol, but from something deeper, something that had shifted inside him. "We did not have the full picture," he said, and the statement was simple, but it carried weight, not as an excuse, but as recognition, and Naomi listened without interrupting, her gaze steady, her posture relaxed, and when she responded, her voice remained calm, unchanged. "Most people do not," she said, and there was no edge to it, no judgment. Only truth delivered without emphasis. And Hayes nodded once, slowly, as if absorbing that, as if understanding that the moment was not about being corrected, but about seeing differently, and he exhaled. A quiet release of something he had been holding since the door first opened, and for a second, the distance between them felt less defined by roles, less shaped by authority, more by awareness, and Naomi opened her car door then, the soft click cutting gently through the quiet, and she paused before getting in, her hand resting on the frame, her eyes lifting once more toward the building, then back to Hayes, and she spoke one final time, not loudly, not pointedly, just clear. Next time, ask before you assume. And the words settled into the space between them without force, without demand, yet impossible to ignore, and Hayes did not respond immediately, because he did not need to. The message already understood, already carried, and Naomi slipped into the driver's seat, closing the door with a quiet finality. The interior light fading as the engine started smoothly, and she pulled away without urgency, her car merging into the empty street, disappearing into the night with the same calm certainty she had carried from the beginning, while Hayes remained where he was, watching the space she left behind, the silence returning once more, but this time it felt different, not empty, not unresolved, but marked by something that would stay with him long after the night had ended. The streetlights stretched ahead in long, quiet intervals as Naomi's car moved smoothly through the nearly empty road, the city still resting in that fragile space between night and morning, and inside the vehicle there was no rush, no tension carried over from what had just happened, only a steady focus that matched the rhythm of the road beneath her tires, her hands resting lightly on the wheel, her eyes forward, alert but calm, and the world outside passed in soft reflections across the windshield, storefronts dark, traffic signals blinking yellow, the occasional passing car nothing more than a brief interruption of light, and she followed the route already mapped in her mind, each turn deliberate, each decision aligned with something larger than the moment she had just left behind. And in the quiet of that drive, the earlier scene did not replay in fragments, it settled instead as context, as one more reminder of how quickly perception could shape action and how easily truth could be overlooked when it did not match expectation. And she adjusted the rearview mirror slightly, not out of habit, but awareness, confirming what she already knew, that nothing followed her except the fading echo of a night that had already moved on, and several blocks away. Hayes finally got into his cruiser, the engine starting with a low hum that filled the silence he had been standing in, but he did not pull away immediately, his hands resting on the steering wheel as he stared ahead. The reflection of the dashboard lights casting a faint glow across his face, and the stillness inside the car felt different from the stillness outside, heavier, more personal, and he exhaled slowly, his mind not racing, not searching for justification anymore, but turning inward, examining something quieter, something that had shifted in a way he could not ignore, and he glanced once more toward the street Naomi had taken, now empty, and for the first time that night, there was no urgency in him, no need to act. Only a recognition that what had happened would not stay confined to a report or a routine call. It would remain, shaping the way he saw the next door, the next face, the next assumption before it formed, and he started to drive then, slower than before, his path no longer defined by response, but by reflection, and across the city Naomi reached a dimly lit intersection, the red light holding her for a moment, and she rested there, her gaze steady, the quiet ticking of the signal marking time in a way that felt almost intentional, and she looked ahead, not at the light itself, but at what lay beyond it, the route unfolding in her mind, the next location already waiting, and when the light turned green, she did not hesitate. She moved forward with the same calm certainty that had carried her through every moment of the night, and the car continued down the road, disappearing gradually into the distance, the glow of the taillights fading until it became just another part of the city's rhythm. And somewhere behind her, in a quiet apartment now empty but unchanged, the jacket still hung on the wall, the files still open on the desk, the map still marked with points that told a story in progress. And the silence inside that room remained, not empty, not forgotten, but full, holding the weight of a moment where nothing needed to be said for everything to be understood. And as the night slowly gave way to the earliest hint of dawn, the world outside continued as it always did, unaware of the shift that had taken place in a single room, between a single assumption and a single truth, leaving behind a stillness that did not demand attention, only awareness, the kind that stays long after. The moment itself has